here's a glimpse of some highlights from 2017. BGU SAT and Dido Space Pharma launch. Amazing separation of 104 satellites from PSLV, on-board camera. SpaceX conducts the world's first launch of reused stage of launch vehicle. Duhafat 2 launch. Venus satellite launch. LIGO detection of colliding neutron stars. Voyager spacecraft, 40 years of space exploration and still going on. Cassini, grand finale of epic science mission to Saturn. SpaceX BFR is revealed, world's largest launcher and spaceship. Oceans beneath Enceladus' icy crust. Potential for life. Nexus Space Pharma launch. Nexus Space Pharma satellite arrives to the International Space Station. Unveiling of Falcon Heavy, largest launcher of SpaceX. Get ready, take your seat. The final countdown is about to begin. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good morning and welcome you all to the second day of Ilan Ramon's conference. And I have the honor to present the first speaker today, Mr. Luc Saint-Pierre, who is the Chief of Space Application Sections of UNOOSA. He is a geographer in his profession, holds a master's both in geography and also in environmental economics from Imperial College. He is from Canada. And Mr. Saint-Pierre, please come.
Thank you, Mr. Ben Israel. What is a geographer doing here? I think I'll give you a very different perspective to what you've heard probably yesterday from very interesting, different presentations. Geography, many students here, probably the course that you hate the most in high school and after. If it's any comfort, it's the only class I'd flunk in high school, so didn't turn out so bad. Anyway, yes, it is very different. Are we going to talk about what are the needs of developing countries under what we know as the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals? back in 2015, member states of the United Nations agreed on a series of very challenging global agendas, including on climate change, including on disaster risk reduction, but mostly on an agenda for 2030 for sustainable development with a series of sustainable development goals, 17 to be precise. Yesterday we heard a lot about different technologies, different tools, new services that will be provided, more precisions, better prices. There were questions about is there a market for cheaper solutions, for example. There's obviously a market for cheaper solutions, if I can start with that, because for over 30 years now, lots of government authorities in developing countries, civil society, NGOs have been heavy users of space applications. So I don't think the question is there a market for cheaper solution, or maybe more precise, more relevant solutions, but the question would be, is the space community able to deliver what the end users need really under those development agenda? And that's what I want to go to. Okay. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has 17 goals. And you would have seen from different UN organizations, international organizations, from oil producers, from car makers, from a wide range of entities, how their activities fit under the 17 goals. How, for example, organizations like WMO on meteorological organizations has relevant activities under goals under climate. What is important if we really want to promote the space solutions that we think as actor of that community, if we want them to be really useful in developing nations, we have to go beyond those 17 goals. We have to look at how we can we serve different countries with different priorities under these 169 targets. There are national targets to be reached, and there are priorities, and space solutions, including Earth observation, global navigation system, satellite telecommunications, and very importantly, the integration of these solutions must be very well targeted to help countries reach those targets. And we have to promote these tools and show the countries how to equip themselves with the solutions, probably to help them to reach those goals. There's a series of indicators also. In 2015, there was a lot of interest and a lot of motivation to go towards those goals, and a lot of energy also spent in defining exactly what was to be achieved. What the realization now is that for most developing countries, and in many developed countries, the basic data doesn't exist. The basic tools for government authorities to collect the data, to analyze the data, even to define their baseline data, do not exist. So the means of measurements, there's like the day after realization, a big headache. We committed to very important things, very challenging things. We have to find the economic resources, the financial resources to get there, but we need the data. And that's where the space actors or the providers of solutions need to be very precise in what they can deliver, and make sure that countries understand what are the possibilities, the limitations of the different tools. And this is not yet happening, and we're working as the United Nations with member states that work with us in trying to define how to do that properly. And it is urgent. 2030 is like the day after tomorrow. Okay, we have to be present everywhere, and the challenges are important. The UN Office for Outer Space Affairs, very briefly, and you don't have to, you can read only the bold character. We have different functions. It exists since probably over 50 years now. It is also the secretariat of an intergovernmental committee, which is actually meeting this week and next in Vienna. Like every year, there's a scientific and technical subcommittee who's meeting, made of 85 member states with a large number of observers also from different sector, including more and more from the private sector and civil society. And they're looking at partnerships, developing initiatives to work together. The problem in the context of Sustainable Development Goals is the composition of that committee, the delegations that represent their country. They're mostly in either space sector or environment or authorities responsible for climate change. But very few of them, if any, has any word to say in their country on the SDGs. So it's not the perfect community. If you look at who's responsible in different countries to measure, to promote, to make sure that a specific country goes toward the SDG, it's very often the statistic authority, okay, either an institute or under a ministry. And these statisticians who have that important responsibility are often still much more comfortable with surveys and censuses. There's not much trust in satellite imagery. So to promote that even at the country level, that the tools are essential to be able to plan properly and to report properly is very difficult. So the platform still has to be created. And this problem should not be minimized because we can design I'll talk less with my hands and more with my mouth. The need to have proper solution is important. We saw many examples yesterday. But if they are not used, if they're not accepted, if they're not streamlined in the decision-making process, those tools will not be used properly. And we have so many examples. If you look back at 2010, the earthquake in Haiti, there were thousands of products, maps, services, data sets that were provided very quickly. And there are reports that say that probably one map out of 100 was actually useful in Haiti after the earthquake, okay? So we need to refine our way of working. So the committee is one platform for that. And again, don't go just for the characters in bold. The office has different roles in addition to being a secretariat of this intergovernmental committee, which is now defining an agenda of work also towards 2030. The office is also responsible for different programs, some of them under the section I'm leading. For example, the program on space applications, which provides a lot of capacity building activities in the form of workshops, symposium, trainings, including also a program called UN Spider, which is specifically for information in disaster management and emergency response. And I will be using UN Spider to demonstrate a little bit how I think we should be looking at the needs of member states or developing countries. And there are other initiatives we're responsible for. I invite you to look at our website, UNOOSA.org simply. There are different documents, for example, on annual reports and others that you can consult. UniSpace plus 50, excuse me. In this year, actually in 2018, the space community is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the first international space conference back 50 years ago, deciding a little bit on what international collaboration should be. We take the opportunity of this 50th anniversary next June to propose with the member states a Space 2030 agenda. Really what the office, what the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, what the space actors, including the new actors that we're starting to work with, private sector, we saw many examples yesterday, trying to define how we can work better towards 2030, in particular to help countries reaching their sustainable development goals. And again, that's very different. We're not talking only about cooperation for space exploration or scientific studies. We're talking about bringing the applications down to the users much, much more, and with more resources, so that instead of being able to work with 3-4 countries per year, and maybe next year, the community should be working with 50-60 countries a year, and every year until there are changes. So UniSpace plus 50 is a milestone for us. There are different initiatives under that. Very quickly, it was a very complicated process. It's going to culminate with the conference of the Committee on the Peaceful Use next June. What's important is those 4 red boxes. That's probably why I flung geography. I'm colorblind, so I've never been very good with maps, in fact. But those, I guess, red boxes show 4 pillars where this Agenda 2030 should be looking into. Space economy. The involvement of the private sector, what we heard yesterday, that more and more the private sector will take more space. This developed businesses. This is a factor for economic development in developing countries. Having startups providing localization services, having more university programs available in STEM and space sciences, for example. This brings a national, a domestic capacity to develop its economy around the space sector. Space, what is important space to me is space accessibility and space society. When I say to me, to the activities I'm trying to coordinate, I will get into that later. What's important also is to see at the bottom, those are the 5 main areas of interest of the UN agenda for sustainable development. So the whole agenda that is being developed now and starting to be reviewed this week in Vienna with probably very hot debate is to define what are the priorities, what form of partnerships should be developed towards implementing really very specific roadmaps between now and 2030 in different stages with different responsibilities, with more resources. This is what is being discussed, but aiming at reaching the end users. And the end users, for me, sorry, being a geographer, being responsible for space applications section, is not a government that wants to launch 20 satellites or build a launcher. The end users are the local authorities, the mayor in small cities that needs to have an evacuation plan in case of disaster. They're the managers of environmental resources who needs to develop adaptation measures against sea level rise. Those are the ones I want our efforts to reach. In this whole process, without trying to understand everything, because ourselves we're starting to understand it actually, there are two priorities that are very relevant, that were agreed upon by this, through this process and will be defined or agreed again with more detailed roadmaps this summer, is one, thematic priority 6, which looks at resilient societies. And that we're going back to this agenda of reducing vulnerability against disaster, reducing vulnerability against changing climate, and reaching those sustainable development goals. So there are different activities that were undertaken, different conferences. We agreed with main actors on different roadmaps that should be implemented, and hopefully it will lead to a General Assembly, a UN General Assembly resolution later this year, approving the whole process, putting it at a very high level within the UN system, recognized by member states that space technology have the potential to bring benefits in this whole 2030 agenda. Another priority that is very important to our service is the 7th one, in capacity building for the 21st century. The office, the program on space applications and SPIDER have been doing since up to 40 years a lot of activity in capacity building. We need to be more modern and target more very specific, again, users. So this is the basis. The Space 2030 agenda, actually, we heard yesterday or Sunday evening, I think in one of the introduction, talking about the digital divide. We're now bringing the term space divide, and that concept was not present yesterday at all, and it exists, it's extremely deep. Again, we might have the best technical solutions to solve all kinds of problems, but believe me, they do not reach, large proportion of that do not reach developing countries. We work in different areas in many developing countries all over the world, and we see authorities, national authorities with a mandate to plan for disaster management. They are not aware that Landsat imagery is free online. They are not aware that there's an international mechanism, the international charter that can provide data and products after a disaster. They might have 2 staff with access to internet a few hours a day if there's electricity. Okay, so there's a huge divide in access to space technologies, to the capacities to use space technology. And again, it should not be underestimated. There are many countries who are moving fast in that direction, but there's a large number of countries, particularly in Africa, in Latin America, who are not following. And language is an issue, access to technology is an issue, so it has to be, again, not underestimated. Okay, we can skip this. The whole process is to take us to this Space 2030 agenda on these 4 pillars. If we look at space society, what does it mean exactly? It means getting access for space applications for global health. Again, low emission and resilient societies. Space for human security, it's a very important thematic under the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space. Developing more services for space weather, more early warning system of space weather event. What is the relation with space weather and international development? It's one thing to propose full set of solutions based on Earth observation satellite and GNSS system, but if these systems, these platforms, this architecture is not sustainable, if it's at risk towards in front of space weather events, then we're not able to provide the services properly or in an autonomous and permanent manner. So the connection between the space infrastructure, and that's where the committee is working hard to make sure that the services that are being offered by member states is continuous. And different initiative, again, Space for Women, Open Universe, which is now a new initiative. We want to connect different providers of data on astronomical observation, trying to develop more network to get to make access to that type of information, not only for research, but also for citizens who can, again, use that as platforms to promote education in science, that, for example. So making space technology more inclusive, more accessible. It's much more than just outreach and promotion. It's really educational program. It has implications on how we work with the academia, how we try to organize a little bit more the availability of the different training opportunities, how to make that more coordinated in a way. The second pillar of those four that is important is space accessibility. We use more and more the term access to space, which means access to space exploration and innovation, but which also mean access to space-based data, products, services by different providers, how to make sure, again, it reaches the end users. And that's the main benefit, I think, of this international coordination. It is really to bring, to increase that access. I said we have about 85 member states, and it's increasing a little bit this year, I believe. They're not all spacefaring countries, of course. They don't want all of them to be spacefaring countries, but they want to have a word in these different agendas. Like developing countries have a very important word in the Sustainable Development Agenda. The same happens there, and they want to have access to those benefits. They want to help define how they can increase that access, how they can have more, be more recognized, or their needs more recognized, and that's where I'm leading to. Probably a little bit faster, sorry. Sorry. I mentioned one of the program under the section, which is called UN Spider. We've been functioning for 10 years now, 11 years, with support with the government of China, government of Germany and Austria, and also some resources from the UN itself. We have small field offices in Beijing and Bonn, Germany, where we have different functions. But this program is very different to the rest of the Office for Outer Space Affairs, works in some manner a bit more independently, in the sense that we do much more work at the country level. We do technical advisory missions, for example, where we go and do fact-finding mission to assess what are the needs of the authorities responsible and the actors with responsibilities in disaster management, in disaster risk reduction, in emergency response, in early warning systems. And we have been working with probably about 50 countries in the last 10 years. So we did develop quite a good understanding of what are the needs, and that's what I want to insist on in the next few minutes. So I invite you to look at the knowledge portal of UN Spider. You will find that easily. We try to package, classify information on space solutions, including on data sources, but in wording and classification that is useful for manager of disaster authorities in developing countries. So a user will not be looking for a specific sensor or a specific type of imagery, but he or she will look at how to make flood risk map in a semi-dry or sub-Saharan country. And then it will lead that person to a set of solutions to be considered. And we want to amplify that approach under the Space 2030 agenda. And we do also a lot of training activities at the country level that follow these assessments. So contrarily to maybe trends in the last 10, 20 years where international organizations, development banks arrive in a country and say, we'll give you a training on radar imagery and we'll form 20 persons. We do provide training in radar imagery, but we identify, is it a priority of the country or is there any other priority, and who should be trained and which authority should have access to the data set? How do we organize the data set for them to be, to have access to them and use them properly? Which trainer should we bring in to these countries to make sure it works? So much more targeted, a bit more personalized in a way, but we want to amplify that approach again. And what's important, it's the central box. I will not venture on its color, but these different bullets, if you can read, policy making, awareness raising, capacity building, coordination, information sharing, data standards and access. Those are the type of issues that we assess. Who has the data? Which organization has the data? Is there any data sharing practices, if no policies in the country? We see many countries where the recognized disaster management authority responsible to produce data and early warning system in case of any type of disaster we see often that these authorities have to buy the data sets from the land survey in the same government, okay? And this is widely the case, and we try to change these practices or bring new practices. So these assessment missions not only help the country in identifying what could be their priorities in accessing data and making sure there is a coordination to improve the quality of the service brought to citizens, but also we suggest how to do that and what are the steps, and we're able to also mobilize resources to assist the country in implementing those different recommendations. So as I said, we did that kind of assessment in a large number of countries, followed by trainings from Latin America to Southeast Asia. We're now developing partnerships to do that also in other regions. I see a sign that says time up, but I believe I have a bit more time. So this exercise over 10 years allowed us to collect about probably something like 200, 250 different recommendations, many of them applying in a specific country, but many being generic. And we look at those. We went back to the countries and see, did you implement that? Has that changed the situation? Have your priorities changed? And we work in that sense, and in these different areas of interest, we're able to analyze that. And we came up with packages of projects. So again, don't read that, but what kind of international collaboration projects should be put in place for countries to have access to the proper data? What kind of coordination at the national and regional level with development banks, with regional organizations can be put in place so that specific number of countries can implement certain recommendations and move forward in their access to space? I take the example of disaster, but please understand that this kind of approach can also be done in environment, looking at climate change mitigation and adaptation measures, and any other specific SDGs or their targets in health, in education, in partnership development. It's probably difficult to read. But what's important to understand, and that's why I'm leading, and I'll go faster in the next few slides, is that disaster management is not only producing maps where houses and roads were destroyed. It's also about disaster risk reduction. It's about early warning. It's about response, and it's about recovery, which in some countries can be a 10 years time span. And what's important to understand is for each of these phases, it's different authorities, it's different responsibles, it's different actors. Very often it can be very different beneficiaries, okay? It's not the same need at all point in time, and it's not the same need in country A to country B. And it's not the same capacity in country A and country B to access, to understand that information. We should be going, instead of having thousands of maps and having only a few dozens being useful, maybe having only a few dozen maps. And I'm sorry, I had 25 minutes, 30 minutes on the agenda. Can we clarify? Yeah? Okay, sorry. So I will skip these things. The agenda is not clear to me. So there are different needs, different actors, and we have to adapt. So we're not talking about sensors and spectral resolution and coverage. We're talking about producing the good maps for different users at different times for different purposes, and we have to understand that. And these needs should be integrated in the plan of work of the providers of data, of these international collaboration. And so there are different needs. Again, for example, there are mechanisms for international, for example, the International Charter to provide data and provide maps to countries after a disaster, but it's only for that. It's for large disaster, only for 10 days. The Space Charter, which is an extremely good instrument, probably is activated about 40 times a year, I believe. There are hundreds of smaller disasters per year who do not have access to that. So what kind of mechanism can be put in place to help countries also to face all these aspects? So again, different needs and different conditions. We have different projects partnerships that we're putting in place, for example, on early warning system, also on using space technology specifically for disaster risk reduction. We've put in place under this global agreement different initiatives with partners trying to coordinate, put in place, mobilize, sharing resources to have more impact at the country and regional level. I invite you to look at the UNOOSA.org website under this Unispace initiatives, where there's a lot of new initiatives that are being proposed to scale up the approach that we have with SPIDER, also to bring in more partnerships, new types of partnerships. We're talking about developing a catalog of solutions. We're already working with partners such as the European Space Agency, really to have build up a full-scale catalog of technical solutions where countries, where member states can explore and find out what they want. We want to increase also the network, the capacity building initiative, access to training, again, developing catalog of opportunities like that. So they are different initiatives, and we want to wrap that under a more global approach under the Space 2030 agenda. So I think this would be enough for today. Thank you. I'm here all day if there are any questions. Thank you.